This is the most spacious wilderness shelter I've ever seen, large enough to fit a family of 10. Inside, there's a stone fireplace and even a panoramic skylight. There's also a grill for roasting meat. This all began when Jim decided to experience a different kind of life. He quit his hard-earned office job and came out here to build in the wild. The soil here was loose and easy to dig, so he made quick work of it. In just half a day, the foundation was ready. Eager to move into his new home soon, Jim threw himself into cutting pine trees. After collecting enough logs for the frame, he collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. As a Ukrainian, he knew how to deal with fatigue. He jumped straight into a Tendegus river. The icy water refreshed him instantly. Then he returned to continue preparing the wood. To ensure durability, he stripped the bark and branches clean and placed them over the campfire to carbonize. Charred wood resists rot and moisture. Once all the log bases were charred, Jim set them into the pit as the main support posts. With the cold water buff boosting his energy, his progress was surprisingly fast. To improve work efficiency, he decided to build a sawhorse. He cut several equal-length logs with his chainsaw, notched joints with his axe, and fastened them together with old nails. After a round of hammering, a sturdy workbench was done. Now he could process logs easily. No more bending his back all day. With the sawhorse and his axe, he quickly shaped the notches for the crossbeams. After setting the beams across the support posts, he nailed everything tightly in place. Just as he hit his stride, the sky opened up with rain. So, he covered his precious frame with a waterproof tarp to keep the foundation dry. The downpour lasted for 3 long hours, but Jim kept building through the storm. Though the forest air was freezing, he worked up a sweat. By the time the rain stopped, the main structure was firmly in place. Only then did hunger catch up to him. He went into the forest to forage for food. After the rain, the woods were teeming with mushrooms. In no time, he'd gathered a full basket. Feeling frustrated at his slow progress, he punished himself. No dinner until more work was done. Using a rope as a measuring line, he went to cut more logs for the walls. Having once worked as a construction painter, he handled the brush with impressive speed, stripping bark until each log gleamed. To keep sand from washing in, he laid down a waterproof lining first, then gathered a pile of moss to fill the gaps between the logs. Confident in his craftsmanship, Jim didn't even bother using nails for the walls. After finishing half of one side, his hunger finally won. He gave up his self-imposed punishment, cut the mushrooms into chunks, and boiled them over the fire. While the soup simmered, he kept working on the walls. When he returned to reinforce the sand base, he'd only set 2 more logs when his mushroom soup was done. But to his surprise, he actually poured out the tasty broth. Then he moved the mushrooms to a skillet to keep cooking. Plain mushrooms alone wouldn't fill him up. So Jim added some barley to the pan. It wasn't the most nutritious meal, but it brought back a good bit of strength. To burn off that extra energy, he hauled fresh logs from a kilometer away through the snow. After trimming the branches, he quickly raised the second wall. Only 2 walls stood so far, but the build already looked striking. Lost in admiring his own work, Jim didn't notice time slipping by. When he came back to himself, it was 7 p.m. He laid a few logs as a bed frame, spread a moisture pad on top, and dreamed of a hot soak to ease the fatigue. For tonight, he simply made do and slept rough. At dawn, Jim rose from his makeshift bed. The home was crude for now, but at least it was his. Today he vowed to finish the roof, or else go back to washing dishes. He boiled water over the campfire, then spotted more mushrooms nearby. The forest's winter bounty meant less time spent foraging. With a basket full of mushrooms, Jim started on another wall. After setting the first log, he left a gap in the second log and inserted a plastic pipe, a future channel for stored meltwater. A few seconds later, that wall stood finished as well. He banked snow and sand outside to reinforce it, then connected the water line. To keep efficiency high today, he treated himself to a heartier meal. He minced the mushrooms, blanched them briefly, heated oil in the pot, then stir-fried potatoes and onions, and finally tossed the mushrooms back in. A light, lean snow camp meal. Jim ate quickly, then moved on to the roof. Before that, though, he felt using rope for measuring was too slow. So he tapped into his dishwasher ingenuity, bending a nail with his brush handle as a hook and tying the measuring line to it. Measuring lengths went much faster now, and when the weather cleared, the rig could even double as a fishing aid. With his improvised tool, he ripped through the timbers at high speed. A quick cleanup of the edges, then long nails locked them in. Far sturdier than any flimsy lean-to. In little time, half the roof structure was up, but mushrooms alone couldn't fuel such heavy labor. He was spent, barely able to move. So he stoked the campfire, pulled the tarp back over the snowy roof, and took out the meat he'd been saving for 2 days, laying it lovingly over the grill. Bright bell peppers made the perfect side. While the meat sizzled, he prepped a few more logs to serve as tonight's bed slats. Exhaustion hit hard. Today's work felt even rougher than yesterday's. By the time the frame was ready, the roast was done. To sleep well tonight, he brewed himself an extra strong cup of tea. After finishing the meat, he drifted off by the snow-lit fire. The next morning, he lazily rolled out of bed. It had rained through the night, so, after stoking the fire, Jim caught roof runoff in a pot and boiled water for breakfast. Perfect for a snowy camp morning. Feeling guilty for not finishing the roof yesterday, he was determined to make up for it today. He cut several boards and quickly fastened them together, forming a sturdy skylight frame. Then he fixed it onto the roof timbers. With this giant skylight in place, the snow cabin would be flooded with light. He'd built half the skylight yesterday. This morning, the sunshine was so good he sprawled on the floor, basking. One stretch turned into noon, and only then did he begrudgingly get back to work. Since this was the home he planned to keep for life, he nailed off the sideboards carefully. The exterior shape was now basically complete, and the interior looked neat and tidy. After setting the skylight glass, he could sunbathe while lying inside his snow house. After admiring the view, he marked an opening on the roof with a baffle board, prepping for the fireplace flue. With a brutal burst from the saw, he carved a big hole in 3 seconds, then fixed the baffle securely in place. At last, the roof was finished today, and Jim decided he'd earned a reward. He took out a steak that hadn't turned yet, sprinkled on pepper, and gave it a wizard's massage for flavor, then set it on the grill. After that hearty dinner, his spirits lifted. Unable to sleep, he pulled out his phone and watched a few one more video clips, leaving him pale the next morning, eyes glazed over. He struggled up and cooked himself a pot of barley porridge. The color alone promised a strong boost. Re-energized, he focused on the cabin's finer details, packing every gap with moss, laying waterproof membrane over it, and shoveling on soil for reinforcement. Still feeling a bit weak, Jim called an old dishwashing coworker for help. One gathered moss and fill, the other kept processing logs. With the extra hands, his pace improved dramatically. Before long, the front wall was fully sealed and finished. As evening fell, he thanked his friend properly, bringing out his treasured pork rump, simmering it in water, then frying the vegetables in the rendered lard, adding water and scattering in rice. That single meal cost him a week's worth of supplies. But while Jim cooked, his coworker gifted him a small stove. A quick install later, with a friend and a fireplace for company, the snowy night felt far less lonely. The food looked and smelled amazing, and both of them ate contentedly, lying back on the bed. With company tonight, Jim skipped the phone entirely and slept with a rare sense of safety. At dawn, they washed up at the riverside. Then, at Jim's request, his friend stapled waterproof sheeting to the walls, and together, they shoveled snow and soil to bury the hut snugly. Finally, they spread the moss his coworker gathered yesterday across the entire roof. With that, the snow shelter, half bunker, half cabin, was complete. Today, after lighting the fireplace, he reinforced the chimney again. But the gifted stove from his friend just didn't match the look of the place. So he went outside to haul big stones, planning to set them around the hearth. Moving those boulders was brutal work, but last night's meal gave him the energy. He stacked the rocks around the fireplace, and the whole room immediately felt right. One of the big stones even worked as a shelf. Satisfied, Jim removed the waterproof sheeting his friend had stapled and packed yesterday's gaps with fitted wood. The best surprise here was the sheer amount of moss. Plenty to spare, so he could fill every last crack as tight as stone. To test the skylight's light flow, Jim sealed the doorway with tarp. Through the skylight, he could see at once. The interior was bright, and the cabin held a steady 23 degree C. After the test, he decided to make a skylight screen. Chainsaw in hand, he milled fresh boards. Even though he'd only been in the wild a short while, he'd grown deft with the saw. Soon, a neat stack of planks was ready. You'd swear they came from a mill. He nailed the slats together, simple and solid, and set the screen over the skylight. It would block falling leaves and keep the dawn glare from waking him too early. With that done, he turned the leftover boards into wall shelves. You could see his new home growing more complete by the hour. Dinner was yesterday's beef. While it simmered, Jim split firewood by lantern light. Winter was closing in, and he needed a deep stash. With a big bundle stacked, the beef was ready. He cut it into chunks, stirred in tomato paste, and let it bubble again in the rich broth. Not bad for someone who used to be a restaurant newbie. It wasn't fancy, but it hit the spot. By the next morning, frost silvered the world outside. Winter was nearly here. Jim got moving quickly. Today he'd build an underground oven. The ground hadn't frozen yet, so digging was easy. He opened a pit 1/2 meter deep, gathered stones, and cut a vent channel to the side. Crushed rock lined the oven bed, and a plank served as a vent baffle. After backfilling with sand and soil, the earth oven was done. For the lid, he used milled boards. His steady hands made them lie perfectly flat. Once he'd cut enough, he set them over the oven. With ingredients scarce, he decided to save the new oven for later. For now, a simple grilled meat would do. And in a few days, he'd head to town for supplies to see him safely through the deep cold. A couple of days later, Jim returned with essentials. As temperatures kept dropping, life in the snow cabin needed upgrades. This trip, he bought a planer to make every board in his winter home smooth as glass. To test out his new toy, he gathered more planks of wood. Then, using a plane, he polished their surfaces smooth. These boards were meant for a large door. After quickly assembling the frame, he suddenly remembered he hadn't tested the oven yet, so he abandoned the door project right away. Removing the cover plate, he piled enough firewood inside. The great ventilation made the flames burn fiercely. Then he went out to collect more vines, hoping to finish the half-done barrier from last time. The weather was getting colder by the day. If he slacked off now, he might freeze to death in his sleep. He fixed the oven's cover firmly in place, then held up the door frame to check its size. Just as he was about to start cutting the door panel, he remembered the charcoal in the oven. It should be ready. So he took out a piece of meat, carelessly rubbed on some seasoning, wrapped it in foil, and tossed it into the oven to roast. He covered the oven's surroundings with thick moss, so the trapped heat inside would make the temperature even higher. After waiting for over 20 minutes, Jim felt the meat still wasn't done. So while waiting, he started working on a bed frame. Looks like the big door would have to wait. After sawing just 2 planks, the sky had already turned dark. He took the roasted meat out and ate it, then went back inside his little hut. For tonight, the door still relied on his waterproof tarp. After sealing the entrance, Jim began carving wooden joints inside. For better insulation, he needed each board to fit perfectly together. It wasn't until deep into the night that he finally finished. Poor guy, he had spent the entire day crouched on ice in 30° without catching a single fish, and even wasted a precious chunk of meat. If he joined alone in the wild, he'd be gone in a day. The next morning, Jim noticed the floor was filthy. He decided to start making proper flooring. After dismantling the bed frame, he gathered pieces of wood of suitable size and neatly laid them across the ground. For a more polished look, he chose wooden boards near the entrance. His bed, though, remained very simple. Jim clearly preferred sleeping rough. By nightfall that day, he had nearly finished laying the floor. The next morning, the whole world outside had turned white. Jim immediately began chopping firewood. Although it was freezing outside, his cabin stayed warm inside, thanks to great insulation. Today, he planned to finish the remaining flooring. But Jim's habit of procrastination struck again. By the time the sky darkened, he was only just fitting the last plank in place. After a quick cleanup, his home finally looked tidy and bright. At least now, he could walk without kicking up dust. That day, he rewarded himself with a pan-fried chicken breast. Though his progress was slow, at least the floor was finally complete. By the 3rd morning, the snow outside had grown thick. To keep the front door from being buried, he took up his shovel and began clearing the snowdrifts. To make it easier to move in and out, he sawed a few wooden planks. Then, using his hammer, he nailed down a base. Finally, he nailed the planks on top, forming something that worked as both a table and a staircase that made you bump your head if you stood too tall. To make winter life easier, he needed to stockpile more firewood. The current pile would only last a day or two, and his food was running out fast. To get more food, Jim decided to go ice fishing. The ice here was thick and solid, so he wasn't worried about falling through. Then he began playing with his handmade lure. But after shaking it for ages, no bites at all. Frustrated, Jim decided to change spots. He drilled a new hole in the ice. After half an hour, still no fish, just freezing cold. Unable to stand it anymore, he went ashore to make a fire. The warmth brought instant relief. In anger, he pulled out a chunk of meat from his pack, then placed it right on the grill to roast. With food sizzling, his mood quickly improved. Recharged, he went back to fishing again. But luck clearly wasn't on his side. In the end, he packed up and decided to go home. At least snow made fetching water much easier. He just needed to gather enough snow, melt it, toss in some greens, and that would make a simple dinner. But that night, Jim could hardly sleep. Not only was his stomach empty, he had also wasted a precious piece of meat. As winter passed, Jim's father came to visit his little cabin. Because of his father's arrival, Jim didn't want him to sleep on a log bed, so he built a new bed frame nearby with smooth planks, something more comfortable for his father. Once that was done, Jim started up the oven again, hoping to show off his cooking skills. While waiting for the coals to heat up, the two of them gathered a huge pile of moss to decorate the right side of the hut. Then Jim went back inside, took out a piece of meat, rubbed it generously with spices, and let it sizzle over the coals. After that, he wrapped it in foil and placed it in the oven. To his father, Jim would always be a child. Wanting to help him out, the father began sawing firewood beside him. They worked together until the steps were neatly stacked. Soon after, the meat was finally done. Since he rarely ate his son's cooking, the father savored every bite with delight. The next morning, they noticed the space under the stairs held too little wood. To make storage easier, with his father's help, Jim built a simple wooden frame. When all the pieces were joined, it became a basic woodshed. They covered the top with moss, making it blend perfectly with the cabin. Finally, the father helped him fill the shed with wood. Seeing that his son was doing well, he left, reassured and proud. But due to the war between Russia and Ukraine, Jim had to return to the city. By the time he came back here, several months had passed. His entire shelter was now covered in green. Inside, it was full of dust and fallen leaves. It took Jim half an hour to clean the whole place spotless again. To build a proper stone fireplace, he collected piles of rocks from nearby, then arranged them neatly around the woodshed. Before building the stone fireplace, with temperatures rising, he wanted to first make a place to store food. He marked the opening of a cellar on the floor. After lifting those floorboards, he began sawing with a handsaw. Because he'd drawn guidelines, his cuts stayed true. And when the boards were nailed into a frame, he grabbed a shovel and started digging. Though the cabin sat partly underground, the soil inside was surprisingly dry. Once the pit was ready, he spread crushed stone inside, then set the floorboards back in place. A simple, handy, cold cellar. When it was done, starving, he immediately started cooking, rewarding himself with a fine roast. Now, looking around the home, what bothered him most was the gifted fireplace. So he decided to rebuild and improve it. The next morning, it hit him that he still hadn't truly started the fireplace work. Annoyed, he jumped out of bed and got to it. He scrapped the old setup entirely, moved the surrounding stones aside, and re-leveled the ground. Then he hauled in an iron frame, anchoring it firmly to the floor. Next, he mixed a batch of clay, and with the crushed stones he'd collected earlier, packed and layered them evenly around the frame. It looked easy, but every stone was heavy. He toiled for hours to set them right. At last, he fitted the stovepipe in place, and the stone fireplace stood completed. To help it dry quickly, he lit a fire inside at once. Aside from a little smoke backflow, nothing else went wrong. With the fireplace done, Jim decided to carve himself a wooden bowl. For a proper bowl, he needed a thick log. He selected a suitable piece, set it across the sawhorses, and cut a groove in the middle to clamp and steady the work. Then he took a block of wood, roughed it down, and sketched a bowl's outline on top. Out came a set of carving knives. He shaved thin ribbons from the inside, the curls peeling off like noodles. Within minutes, he had hollowed the center clean. Then, with a hatchet, he refined the rim, smoothing the edges. In the quiet forest, only the rhythm of Jim's carving echoed. Before the bowl was perfect, heavy rain began, but Jim still managed to finish it beautifully. He admired the view for a moment, then headed into the forest to gather mushrooms. With resources abundant, he quickly found a haul of porcini. He sliced the meat patties, stir-frying them in the pan. Then in went the vegetables, and finally the porcini. A balanced, hearty meal came together. When the stir-fry was done, he poured it into a clay pot, added spring water, and slid it back into the oven to braise. No doubt about it, Jim's cooking had improved a lot. This meal looked, smelled, and tasted wonderful. The next morning, he dug a pit beside the terrace, then went to collect a pile of timber. Then he fetched a steak from the cellar. Thanks to the insulation, it hadn't spoiled at all. Jim grilled it over the rack and polished it off in no time. Next, he processed the freshly felled logs, marking out a frame for a storage box. Using the logs as walls, he built an outdoor storage chest. All he had to do was cover it back with moss. And aside from keen-nosed animals, and you viewers watching along, no one would know the chest was there. Now all of Jim's tools could be tucked neatly into this box. The next morning, the place looked grimier the more he stared at it. So he tore up all the floorboards and with his trusty family heirloom brush, scrubbed away every trace of dust. For a former dishwasher like him, scouring timber was child's play. Once the boards were clean, he removed the skylight cover as well. After months of wind and rain, the cover had started to rot. So Jim felled a tree on the spot, fixed the frame with nails, and then sawed 2 stout boards to craft a brand new skylight cover. Half a year in the wild had honed his skills. His workmanship had clearly improved. Now the cover matched the skylight perfectly. With nothing urgent left, he mixed a batch of clay and fashioned a door for the stone fireplace. When that was done, his neat freak side kicked in. He dashed to the river for a bath, then came back and relaid all the floorboards. Even after all that scrubbing, it looked about the same as before. Once the floor was down, Jim lit the fireplace. The firebox opening sat low, so he had to lie flat to spark it up. But once it caught, the cabin warmed right up. To reward himself for a hard day's work, he skewered some marinated lamb and buried a few potatoes in the coals. Lamb kissed by charcoal ash always tastes better. Such luxury! Not everyone gets to live like this. The following morning, fickle as ever, Jim gathered more planks. He wanted to build a new dining table. The old one no longer fit his tidy home. He set the leg brackets and fixed the table to the wall. Pleased with himself, he grabbed a handful of nails to reinforce the floor. Hard to believe he'd walked for a year on boards that wobbled like that. When the job was done, his body cried out for a sauna. So he removed the oven's cover plate, drove 4 posts into the ground, and marked them as anchor points, planning a small new hut just for steam baths. But with the outbreak of war, Jim had to put the project on hold, for now. Thank you for watching until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the little bell so you won't miss the next exciting survival adventures. Finally, share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next journey.